Hey guys, Colleen here. So, I've received quite a few questions about bringing your vintage amp on tour with you. So, in this video, I'll be talking about my process for servicing an amp for tour. But first, I want to thank our newest sponsor, Rattlesnake Cable Company, for supporting my channel. Rattlesnake makes awesome, high quality, super customizable cables to suit any of your musical needs. Viewers of my channel get 20% off, and Rattlesnake is currently doing a giveaway for 2 free cables. So see the links in the description for more info on that. All right, let's get down to it. So it's always recommended that you take your amp in for a service and checkup before you take it out on tour, especially if the amp hasn't been serviced in a few years or used in a while. When I'm evaluating a vintage amp for like a regular service, I want to find that balance between maintaining the amp's originality and original character, while also making the amp safe and reliable to use. The depth of the service is always discussed with the client. When somebody brings me an amp to service to prepare for tour, the same applies, but I do have to consider a few more factors. Old parts, specifically electrolytic caps. If a vintage comes in for regular service and the caps are original, but they're within spec, they're not leaking or bulging, and the amp is functioning properly, then I won't push to replace the filter caps. I always tell the client it's really hard to predict when the caps will fail. They're working now, but just keep in mind that they will fail eventually. These are old parts and they dry out over time. Typically, people do opt to replace the old filter caps to prevent, issues with possible tube failure or even in some cases transformer failure if a cap does fail. So yeah, people do opt to replace them, but some people like to keep the amp as original as they can and just replace things one by one as they go. But for reliability and longevity, if an amp is going on tour, I always will push to replace those old filter caps. You do not want a cap to fail on the road. You want to just make sure that the amp is as strong as it can be, that the power supply is strong and it's not going to let you down. So tubes. This is also a really hard part to predict its lifespan or failure. If the amp has nice old vintage tubes in it and the tubes are working, there's no noise, there's no sketchiness, I will typically say let's leave in those old tubes, because old tubes tend to be more durable and people prefer how they sound to modern tubes a lot of the time. So I will say, let's just leave these old tubes in, because unfortunately, modern tubes are not as durable or reliable. It can be really difficult to predict when they'll go, but if people have old tubes in their amps, I will say enjoy them until they go. Unfortunately, there are ebbs and flows of premature tube failures. There have been instances, especially with 6v6 tubes, moments in time where I'll just have a bunch of failures, and this could be because of poor quality control, a bad batch, whatever. I definitely have to be careful and pick and choose which types of tubes I use for which applications, because I've had bad experiences in the past where I'll put in a fresh set of so-and-so tubes and the client goes out on tour and the tubes fail, and that's a tech's biggest nightmare, because you just service the amp and the last thing you want is for a part to fail. Unfortunately, it's just kind of the nature of the beast these days, but with that said, I put the amp through rigorous testing, whether we're keeping in the old tubes or installing new tubes, just to make sure that as best as I can, the tubes will be reliable. Regardless of if you have newer or older tubes in your amp, I do suggest that you bring some spare tubes with you just in case a tube does fail on the road. The most important tubes to bring would be a rectifier tube replacement and a set of output tubes, maybe a preamp tube, but if a tube is gonna fail, it's usually the rectifier or output tubes. I also suggest that people bring spare fuses just in case you blow a fuse on tour. And if you bring the amp to me for service for tour, you can request some extra parts. I'm happy to do that, to include those parts for you. Or if I'm not your local tech, ask your tech for some spare fuses and maybe some spare tubes. Real quick, I'd like to take a moment to thank DistroKid, another sponsor of my YouTube channel. DistroKid helps musicians upload music to major streaming platforms, and musicians get to keep all of the royalties. Viewers of my channel get 30% off. I will also include that link in the description below. Now, for the final testing process before an amp goes on tour. As a tech, my job is to address the current issues the amp has and also try to make any other issues rear their ugly heads before the amp leaves my shop. To check for any underlying issues that maybe even the player has not noticed or has not even happened yet, I will do a few things. I will kind of like tap and bang around the amp when the circuit's out. I'll like poke around. When the amp's together, I'll give it a couple pats, and just to see if there's any like bad connections, loose solder joints, anything like that. That will kind of help check for any of those issues, and it will also simulate the amp being jostled around in transit as it's on the road. I'll also load test the amp for a few hours, both with like my signal generator and with the guitar, just going back and forth, turning off the amp, let it sit for a while, turn it back on, let it test for a while, just to really put it through its paces, really push it, and just make sure it can handle the pressure of the road and long hours of being used. This helps me feel confident in the amp's health, the tube's health, the functionality of the amp, all of that. Once the amp passes this rigorous testing, I will give it a clean bill of health and wish it the best on the road. My touring clients and my clients in general put a lot of trust in me to make sure that their vintage amps will be reliable. Now, things happen, especially with vintage amps. Just like with old cars, you get your car serviced and then taken on a road trip, and then it breaks down in the middle of your trip. Things happen with old stuff. If your amp breaks down on the road, it's a total bummer. But if this does happen, reach out to your local tech. If it's me, I will help you locate somebody on your journey who can help get the amp up and running. A lot of bands do bring back a backup amp on tour, which is really smart if space allows. So I hope this video gives you some insight if you do want to take your vintage amp on the road. If you have any other questions, please leave them in the comments. If you are going on tour, happy traveling.